Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War. Now, I'm trying to win an award. Please go to coldwarconversations.com and vote for us as Best History Podcast. Thank you.
We ran out of runway. We went through the restraining net, through the fence at the edge of the airfield, across the muddy track, onto the rocks on the beach, where the aircraft caught a little bit of fire.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. This episode is brought to you by the Avro Heritage Museum at Woodford near Manchester, where I am a volunteer. Trevor Jackson is also one of the volunteers, but unlike me, he's a former Vulcan pilot who shares with me his extraordinary career. From his early days with the Royal Air Force Cadet Force to flying iconic aircraft like the BAC Jet Provost, Folland Gnat, Vulcan, Gannet and Canberra, Trevor provides fascinating insights into the life of a military aviator. Discover the challenges and thrills of flying during the Cold War, the intricacies of Vulcan QRA scrambles, and landing on the pitching, heaving deck of an aircraft carrier. This episode is a must-listen for all aviation enthusiasts and history buffs alike. I'm delighted to welcome Trevor Jackson to our Cold War conversation. Why did you join the RAF? How did that come about?
It seemed the logical thing for me to do. I was in the Royal Air Force section of the Combined Cadet Force at school. Thoroughly enjoyed my career. Got my A and B gliding licences. I went up to Hornchurch for pre-assessment for aircrew selection. Got through that. And so they said, once you're old enough, come back and we look forward to seeing you. So it seemed to be the logical thing. The only interesting thing for me was that when I turned up at Hornchurch, they asked me why I hadn't gone to join the Fleet Air Arm, because I came from Portsmouth. And I said, well, I've seen enough of the Navy and I want to join the Royal Air Force. So that was how it came about.
And when was that?
I would have gone to Hornchurch for the first time probably in 1959, because the next time I went they had relocated to RAF Biggin Hill. So it was about that time.
So two classic Battle of Britain stations there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And indeed, at that time when I went to Hornchurch, it was still the old wooden buildings. And the thing that I'll never forget is that inside, on the wall, were all these sketches of the World War II fighter pilots, all done by Pat Rooney. Now that is quite interesting because as we go through this, I met Pat Rooney when I joined the Royal Air Force, and I have a sketch that he did of me.
And by joining the Royal Air Force, did you get that feeling of standing in the shoes or following in that sort of rich, very much an awareness of the rich history of the Royal Air Force?
I suppose, yes, but I was not conscious of it. It was just that from the age of 10, all I wanted to do was fly aeroplanes. I just look back and I think, gosh, how lucky am I to have fulfilled my life's dream from the age of 10 to the day that I retired.
Indeed, and we will be going through this amazing career of yours. Can you talk me through your initial training that you had with the RAF?
Right, well, yes. When I went back to Biggin Hill and expected to sail through, I had a medical problem, and at that time any problems were a no-no, and so they said, sorry, but we can't take you on as aircrew. But I was determined to join the Royal Air Force, so I did, and indeed I found myself on my basic training with a number of national servicemen, and it turned out subsequently that it was one of the very last national service intakes into the Royal Air Force. And I went into a branch of the medical profession, and I was doing what these days are perfectly routine tasks in medical research. But at that time, computers hadn't been invented, neither had microchips, so the equipment was rather large. I was working at the Central Medical Establishment in London for Air Vice Marshal Sir Aubrey Rumble, who was the Queen's heart surgeon. And after a few years, I was doing ECGs on myself, checking that my heart was okay, and it was eventually. And one morning I went in to see Sir Aubrey, and I said, "Sir, it's been a pleasure working for you, but my heart is flying if I can. And I'd very much like to go back down to the Aircrew Selection Centre." And he said, "Right, I will be one of your referees, and if you go along the corridor to Bill Baird, he'll be your other referee." And so I went along to Biggin Hill with some rather important gentlemen as my referees. I got through the test this time, and I joined the Royal Air Force. I was already in the Royal Air Force, but I transferred across to aircrew, went to South Cerney, and from there I went to Acklington up in Northumberland for my basic flying training on the Jet Provost.
What was the Provost like to fly? It was a fun aircraft to fly?
I can't really remember all that much about it, other than the fact that it did what it said on the tin. You could do aerobatics in it, no problem at all, and it was a very forgiving aircraft. While I was at Acklington, Pat Rooney came into my life, and he was quite an aged gentleman by now, and he would continue plying his trade, doing sketches of people, and I think it was £5, and he did a sketch of me.
We're looking at a lovely sketch of Trevor here, which hopefully we'll be able to add to the episode notes and show that.
As you can see, I actually smoked cigarettes in those days. I played squash and bridge, which appear on there, not very well. And after a year, got my wings, and off I went to advanced flying training at Aria Valley then. And then I flew the Folland Gnat. Now that really was a fun aircraft to fly. Had a rate of roll of 400 degrees a second, and so you could roll it rather fast. I remember the great technique was to come from the south over Snowdon, close the throttle, and glide to come down and open up the throttle on final approach at 500 feet, do either a landing or a roller landing.
And at that point, did you know what sort of role you were going to enter, what type of aircraft you were going to be flying with the RAF?
No. One was called into the flight commander's office, as we all were, and asked what our interests were. And at that time, the Air Force needed quite a few pilots to fly the Vulcan. And we were all asked, how do we feel about flying the Vulcan? And I said, well, it's an aeroplane. And so rather than find myself going on to fly Hunters, which apparently I was supposed to have done, I found myself being invited to go to Finningley, to number 230 OCU, where I joined a crew, and we trained up flying the Vulcan B2, because at that time the B1s were all being phased out.
Can you take me through your first flight in the Vulcan?
I can't particularly remember the first flight. I can remember my flight instructor was a lovely Irishman by the name of Paddy Lambert. But I can remember our first solo as a crew. It sounds a bit strange because there were 5 of us, 2 pilots, 2 navigators and the AEO in the back. But we were all going through our pre-flight checks, and the radar had tuned into the BBC, and he had this coming through our headsets, and there we were going through the pre-flight checks, and I think it was the Shelley Man Singers singing the song fly away in my magnificent balloon. And okay, the Vulcan's not a balloon, but that became my theme tune for many years. I never forgot that.
I can imagine that sticking as a memory there. Flying the Vulcan, what was it like to fly?
The Vulcan was a very nice aircraft from a pilot's point of view. The cockpit was very cramped. Very little, you were very friendly with your other crew members. But it was the first time I'd flown an aircraft with other crew people, and so it was a different perspective altogether. And we flew as a constituted crew for a number of years, and it was great fun. We flew around the world several times, and at the end of my time, I shed a tear when I left the Vulcan, but I then became a flying instructor. Initially, quite a change there, because I became a flying instructor on the Chipmunk.
I just want to ask a few more questions around the Vulcan. I've heard that the Vulcan did fly almost like a fighter to some degree in terms of manoeuvrability. Is that an overemphasis, would you say?
No. When Rowley Falk first flew the Avro 698, as it was originally called, the prototype to the Vulcan, it had a bomber aircraft control yoke, and he was so impressed by the manoeuvrability of the aircraft, he said, get rid of that control yoke and put a fighter aircraft control column on, which is why the aircraft was subsequently fitted with the fighter aircraft control column. And of course Rowley Falk subsequently went on to perform a barrel roll at the 1955 Farnborough Air Show, where he got airborne and rolled the aircraft, much to the chagrin of the suits from the SBAC, who asked him to desist from doing it in future.
With your training on the Vulcan, you're trained at that point to fly as a high altitude bomber, I'm presuming.
We did both roles. I was on 44 Squadron and 101 Squadron at Waddington, and our role was both in the nuclear and the conventional role. In the nuclear role, we did our quick reaction alert duties, where we were on 15 minutes readiness at any one time, being brought to 5 minutes readiness or 2 minutes readiness at the behest of the bomber controller in the bunker at High Wycombe. We would drop the nuclear weapon at low level, so we practiced at 300 feet by day and 1,000 feet by night. But we also had a conventional role where we would drop up to 21 1,000-pound HE bombs, and we would drop those from high altitude. So at that time we could go out to El Adem in Libya and drop the sticks of bombs in the desert out there. We also had low altitude weapons which were parachute retarded, which could be dropped from low altitude. So we were very versatile. In fact, the Vulcan was an incredible aircraft because it was designed for high altitude work. When the V-Force went from high level to low level, it was the only one of the three V-bombers that successfully transited from high level to low level because of that fantastic wing that Roy Chadwick had designed. I say Roy Chadwick had designed. He was the initial designer of the aircraft, but it was subsequently changed by Stuart Davies and then Roy Ewins.
Right, yeah, because the other two V-bombers were suffering from structural problems when they were flown at low level, I think, consistently.
Well, the Valiant had, it was made of a suspect alloy, and it broke its main spar. The Victor was using up its fatigue life rather quickly, so they were converted to tankers.
Mm-hmm. And very successful in those roles as well. You mentioned the QRA there. Can you talk me through like a QRA scramble, for example? Would you be seated in the aircraft?
Each station had its own peculiarity with the setup of the QRA. We at Waddington had on Alpha dispersal, it was the old World War II 4 dispersal areas. We had 3 aircraft on QRA for the 3 squadrons. The 4th bay was the reserve for bringing a reserve aircraft on. And the aircraft would be armed, fueled, connected to external power to keep the gyros up and running. And as I say, we were on 15 minutes readiness. We had dedicated dormitories. We could go to the ops centre where we could update our war plans. We had a bomber box that beeped every 10 seconds, letting us know that it was live. And the bomber controller would bring us from 15 minutes to 5 minutes readiness. 5 minutes, we would jump into our crew transport, race out to the aircraft, jump in, and get the engines going. And then we would be stood down. If it was a 0-2, not only would we get the engine started, but we would get the external power disconnected and we would taxi onto the runway. So you would have all the aircraft on the runway ready to go. Then we had to have the daily codes for what we were going to do next, whether to go back to dispersal or to actually get airborne. And of course, as we know, it was always to go back to dispersal. Otherwise, probably none of us would be here today.
Yeah, understood. In the event that you didn't go back to dispersal and you were sent to drop the nuclear weapon, what would have been your target?
Well, it depended. Our targets changed, but it was one of the many targets that we had in Russia. Some of them were very far in, and there was no recovery to the UK. You would have to recover to a third country. How they would feel about that, who knows?
Did you talk amongst yourselves as to what your plans would be after dropping the weapon?
In a light-hearted way, yes, I suppose. Some people used to think that they would go to some island drinking beer and putting their toes in the water, but that was just light-hearted banter, and I think we all realised that it was a one-way mission anyway.
How did you feel about that? What was your view on the fact that if you had to go, you wouldn't come back, and also the magnitude of what you were dropping?
I don't think we allowed it to dwell on our minds too long, because you would possibly end up in some dark place. So it was just, we got on with the job, and we worked hard and we played hard, and it was just one of those phases. Everybody knew that mutually assured destruction was Armageddon, and therefore everything was done to try and avoid it.
You mentioned that your targets were quite deep into the Soviet Union. What was considered the greatest threat to the Vulcan? Was it Soviet fighters or Soviet surface-to-air missiles?
The interesting thing is, when we used to go into plans and update our war plans, the maps, we would draw red circles for where the SAM sites were, and eventually it started off with just red circles, but then towards the end it looked as if somebody had had a nosebleed from Norway down to the Black Sea with all this red everywhere. So it was quite daunting, but you realise that somebody would get through, and that was the positive message.
Presumably you were dropping, was it the Blue Danube? Or?
No. It was the WE-177, the weapon that was developed for TSR-2.
Right.
That was compared with some of the earlier weapons, it was a fairly low yield. It was either a 20 kilotons or a 40 kiloton warhead. Quite adequate.
So I wanted to talk to you about evacuation from the aircraft in the event of an emergency? Because from what I understand, the pilot and co-pilot had ejector seats.
Yes.
But the other 3 members of the crew did not.
No. And I suppose over the years that was a bit of a controversy. But you have to bear in mind that when the aircraft was being developed, it was not thought that the aircraft would be in service for any more than 10 years. The cost of changing the aircraft so that everybody had an ejection seat was phenomenal, and it would have put back its introduction into service by a number of years. So therefore the decision was made, let us leave it with the 2 ejection seats for the pilots and the rear crew get out through the entrance door, which is fine if the aircraft is in the air with the undercarriage up. You can just fall and free fall, no problem. But if the undercarriage was down, the first thing that you would encounter going out through that entrance door would be the nose gear assembly, splatting your nose on that. So a technique had to be developed for them to grab hold of the entrance door strut and swing around to avoid it. If the aircraft was on the ground and the undercarriage was up, or the aircraft had collapsed in some way and you couldn't get out through the door, then if we were not quick enough to get out through the front, we would feel a very heavy boot on our shoulders as these 3 gentlemen from the back would jump on our shoulders and go over the side out of the top of the aircraft. We, of course, had the ejection seat with the handle at the top, or the handle between the knees, but never had to use it.
Different Vulcans that you flew, was there a lot of variation? If you were flying a different Vulcan, did it feel different, or were they very much the same?
Most of them were quite the same. Like all aircraft, or I suppose even cars for that matter, you have the hangar queens who seem to spend an awful lot of time being repaired for one reason or another. Yes, they behaved slightly differently at times, but in the main the aircraft were very responsive, and of course those wonderful Olympus engines, if you had the 301 engines, that was 80,000 pounds of thrust, so it was some machine. We would do air displays around the world, and the Americans appreciated it because we were, as they called us, the 4-engined fighter, and we would do displays within the confines of an airfield, whereas the B-52 would take up the whole of a state to do a flyby.
What would you say was the thing you most liked about flying the Vulcan?
Funnily enough, the thing that was actually quite it had nothing to do with actually flying the aircraft, but if you were doing a night exercise and you got back in the early hours of the morning and you would go to the aircrew feeder for a ham and egg breakfast, and a few of us would then, as dawn broke, go off to Woodall Spa and play a round of golf. That was a nice moment.
I like that image. I really like that image. What would you say is the thing you least liked about flying the Vulcan?
I suppose there were hours of doing nothing really, and I'm not a person who likes to not do something. On QRA, a lot of people, we would play cards, some people would play snooker, table tennis, others made aircraft models. I think some were writing books. There was a lot of time when you were just twiddling your thumbs, really.
Did you ever watch the film Dr. Strangelove at the time?
Oh yes, we all did.
What did you make of it being at the sharp end?
Well, in truth, that film didn't have as much impact as Thunderball, because Thunderball was a very good James Bond film, but it rather Hollywoodized the Vulcan. There is no way that a Vulcan could fly from the UK to Bermuda without refuelling quite a few times. Certainly there is no door from the bomb bay into the cockpit either, and certainly the concept of a gentleman being able to asphyxiate the crew by some gaseous cylinder being attached to the PCC, it was a bit of hyperbole.
With the Vulcan, or at any time, did you undergo any escape and evasion training?
Yes, we had done that really prior to. What we did was sea survival more than anything else, going into the North Sea or down to Plymouth Sound. Sometimes when we went out to the Far East, there would be a jungle survival course that some people went on. I think we all were given instruction in jungle survival.
There was no training as to, if you were captured or anything like that, how you would behave or expected to behave?
Well, other than the usual number, rank and name.
So after the Vulcan, what did you then move on to?
Well, I went to South Cerney Central Flying School, flew the Chipmunk, and from there I went to Church Fenton in Yorkshire, where I had my first encounter with the Royal Navy, because I went to the Helicopter Specialist Pilots School, and which was purely Navy. It was for training their helicopter pilots to fly before flying a helicopter. But I was seconded to Manchester University Air Squadron, and I subsequently became chief pilot at Manchester University Air Squadron. We flew out of Woodvale, and obviously we went to the university in Oxford Road here in Manchester, and that was a fascinating period for me, because you would take people who had never flown before, and at the end of their or prior to the end of their 3 years at university, you had got them trained up to take their private pilot's license, and that was a great moment. Halfway through, of course, we got rid of the Chipmunks and transferred across to the Bulldogs, which was an interesting aircraft because it had a heater in it. So gone were the days of the frozen feet and hands. But one thing I always recall was that the Battle of Britain cocktail party, which is always held in September at RAF stations, one was always asked the question, have you ever jumped out of an aeroplane? Well, of course, you didn't want to jump out of an aeroplane that was okay. But it got me thinking, and I went to the RAF Sports Parachute Association at Weston-on-the-Green and did a free-fall parachuting course, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and subsequently did quite a few free-fall jumps. So at least then at the Battle of Britain cocktail party, I could say, when confronted with this question, have you ever jumped out of an aeroplane? I would say, oh yes, I've actually jumped out of an aeroplane some 35 times now. Just going back to the Chipmunk. The Chipmunk did remain operational, didn't it, in Berlin? Was that the only place that you're aware of that the Chipmunk was still being used? I believe so, yes. Yeah. Though I didn't know that it was being used in Berlin until I subsequently came across a gentleman who had actually was flying it out in Berlin. Of course, we changed the colour scheme from the grey to the white and the red, which and then subsequently we did the same colour scheme in the Bulldog.
So from there, where did you?
Very interesting. I got a call from my desk officer in the ministry asking me if I was still interested in going out to Antarctica. Now, that knocked me. I thought, where's that come from? And I had, while I was on Vulcans at one time, I had put in on my 1369 for future jobs that I would be interested in, I thought flying the Twin Otter out in Antarctica would be an interesting job, and thought nothing more of it. And then subsequently, there it was, would I like to go out to Antarctica? And I said, well, at this stage, no, thank you very much indeed. But he obviously thought I was a bit of an oddball, because when my posting did come up, I was posted to the Royal Navy on 849 Squadron to fly the Gannet, which I'd never seen, and it turned out to be the largest aircraft that the Royal Navy had ever operated off an aircraft carrier, and I'd never seen HMS Ark Royal either, but I soon became familiar with both of them. In fact, I went to Lossiemouth to learn how to fly the Gannet, and I subsequently flew out to America to join Ark Royal, which was in Newport. I walked onto the ship, we set sail, and one day I was told, well, go and strap yourself in the aircraft and launch off the catapult, which was the first time I'd ever had a catapult launch. And of course then I had to get back onto the aircraft carrier, which was fun, and subsequently became quite au fait with this mode of flying aircraft.
As part of your training, had they, sort of set up a strip to look like the size of an aircraft carrier, or not? How were you? Yes,
at Lossiemouth we had the dummy deck landing system set up, where you would see the lights that you would see on the ship. You would see a square, which was the flight deck, marked on the side of the runway. But of course there were no arrestor wires on the runway at all. So that was the practice. And certainly we did not, with the Gannett, go and use the practice catapult launch, which they had, I think it was at Bedford.
But it must have been radically different to landing on an aircraft carrier that's pitching and moving about. I mean, that first landing must have got the adrenaline going.
Somewhat. In fact, unbeknownst to me, the two observers in the back were recording the takeoff and the landing, and subsequently presented me with the cassette, and there's an awful lot of heavy breathing on it, and a few expletives as well. But you're talking about pitching and rolling deck. On one exercise subsequently, we were off the Faroe Islands, and it was a real stinking Atlantic depression, grey. The cloud was virtually down to the sea. It was like a scene out of that film, The Cruel Sea. A lot of white horses. We were on a NATO exercise, and the weather was so bad. Flyco came on to the tannoy and said, fixed-wing flying for the day is cancelled, launch the Gannet. And I was the duty Gannet pilot, and I had to crawl out onto this flight deck where there was a 50-mile-an-hour wind blowing across, and you could taste the spray, get into this aircraft, and we were launched off into this greyness to go and find a couple of enemy ships that were hiding around the fjords of the Faroe Islands. Yes, getting back onto the ship was interesting after that. I think I had a few beers that night.
No video of that landing?
No. Interesting enough, I was on board Ark Royal when the BBC were filming the original Sailor series. We were out in the Caribbean at the time, and I'd got airborne in the Gannet, and the windscreen cracked, completely crazed over, so I couldn't see out the windscreen. And I called Mother, which what we called the ship, and they said, right, we'll recover all the other aircraft and you can recover at the end. And so I recovered to the ship, came round in the circuit, lined up, and of course I could see the ship through the side, but as soon as I lined up I couldn't see very much at all. And I'm just looking through these little cracks, and I managed to land on, and every time you landed you were debriefed by the landing safety officer, and you were graded as to the quality of your deck landing. And some of my deck landings had been questionable, and it was all on the board for all to see. Anyway, Jack said, "Well, Trevor," he said, "that was one of your better landings. I'll give you a green for that one," which was fine. And I asked, had the BBC been filming? And he said, no, we thought you were going to crash on the flight deck, so we got them all out of the way. So my 15 minutes of fame on Sailor never appeared. So.
No, but that's pretty impressive. One of your best landings without actually being able to see the flight deck.
Yeah, I don't think we'll pursue whether I close my eyes thereafter.
And what was the role of the Gannet in the Royal Navy at that time?
It was the airborne early warning aircraft. It had that radar underneath. The RAF had got Shackletons up at with 8th Squadron at Lossiemouth with the same radar underneath the fuselage. And the purpose was to get airborne, mount a barrier for defence of the fleet. The two guys in the back had the radar sets. They would be looking for incoming targets, and they would direct the Phantoms to intercept, or they would direct the Buccaneers for offensive work. Now, of course, subsequently, when the Falklands kicked off in 1982, the Navy, not only did it not have an aircraft carrier, it didn't have the airborne early warning aircraft either. So it was a bit of a struggle without either of those, but obviously were successful in the end anyway.
Yeah. And not the most elegant looking aircraft either.
No, I believe the original test pilot, after his first flight in the Gannett, because you have steps to go up the side and you have to get your feet in the correct one, otherwise it's rather like getting on a horse, you'll be facing the wrong way. And he, in his post flight report, said, "This aircraft is very difficult to get into. I think you should make it impossible." I don't think he was very impressed by it at all.
What did it fly like?
A bathtub.
So probably your least favourite aircraft you flew?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I don't look at aircraft from the point of view of how manoeuvrable they are. It's an experience of what they give you. So it had its moments, but let's say, it's not up there at the high point.
Just wanted to quickly go back to the Vulcan. You mentioned that you flew it around the world. What locations were you flying the Vulcan to?
We flew out to Canada, to Goose Bay, to do a lot of low-flying exercises out there. Or we continue on out to Strategic Air Command headquarters at Omaha, where lots of B-52s. So we had a westabout route, and we would then continue on through the Pacific on out to Australia. We also had an eastabout route where we would go down through the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Gan in the Indian Ocean, Singapore, and then Australia. Or we would do a complete around the world, and I did that on one occasion, flying out westabout and continuing on round after our time out in Australia.
And what were the purpose of these flights?
Well, the Australians wanted air defence exercises, so we were quite happy to offer them that. At one time, the Australians were interested in the aircraft as a possible purchase, but of course it never happened. The other thing was that we would go out to the Australian ranges and drop iron bombs out there. So it was all good flying the flag. You've also got to remember that in the late 1960s, it was good to see the aircraft in all theatres of the world as a exercise, just to let people know we can get anywhere quite quickly.
What was next for you after the Gannet?
After the Gannet, yes, I came back to the Air Force and flew the Canberra. Interesting enough, I was on 360 Squadron at Whitton, which was a joint Royal Naval and Royal Air Force squadron. Now, you may notice that there's quite an RN connection, and I did a lot of time with the Royal Navy. While at Whitton, I was coming up for my retirement from the Royal Air Force, and I took my civil aviation licences, and I retired from the Royal Air Force in 1981 and became a commercial pilot in 1982, flying Boeing 737s with Orion Airways to start with.
Before we go on to your civil career, I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions about your RAF career. What aircraft would you have liked to have flown but never got the opportunity? I didn't say these were going to be easy questions, Trevor.
The Mosquito. Not that the Mosquito was around when I was there. But when I was growing up, another aircraft that I absolutely loved looking at was the Sunderland flying boat. I thought that was a magnificent way of operating. But of the aircraft that were current while I was in the Air Force, I just am so thankful that I flew so many interesting aircraft, and I have fond memories of all of them. Been to most places around the world.
During that career, what were the hairiest incidents you experienced?
Well, I suppose an engine failure on takeoff with the Gnats at Valley, because the ejection seat was not as good as the Martin Baker, you couldn't eject at that stage. So the aircraft was put back on the runway. We ran out of runway. We went through the restraining net, through the fence at the edge of the airfield, across the muddy track, onto the rocks on the beach, where the aircraft caught a little bit of fire, but thankfully one opened the canopy and stepped out onto the beach, having avoided the rocks. Very lucky.
How do you pick yourself up after that and get into a plane again?
Well, I was flying again later that morning. We were picked up by Land Rover, taken to the medical centre where the doc gave us a quick check over. Went back to the flight line and aircraft, get airborne again. So never thought anything more of it until you just asked me.
That's the idea of the questions. That's absolutely the idea of the questions. So you retire, or you leave the RAF in 1981 and transfer to civil aviation.
Yep.
What is it like to do that change in terms of just how different is that for you?
Well, for a start, you've got passengers. Well, I mean, obviously in the Royal Air Force, you've got Air Support Command doing exactly the same thing. But I was not part of that anyway. But in civil flying, the rules are different because you're under the CAA rules, or you were at that time anyway. And you've got passengers and you've got crew, which was something entirely new. I mean, I'm not talking about pilots, I'm talking about cabin crew, which I'd never ever had before. And but you just take to it like a duck to water, and that's it. Obviously, the places that you fly to are different, and it's all very formal flying. Certainly no more aerobatics.
Did you ever fly to places in Eastern Europe or Moscow or anywhere like that in any of your civil aviation career?
I flew to Leningrad on one occasion, or St. Petersburg, I should say. Yes, took an orchestra there, but that was very much later on. That was when I was flying the DC-10 with another company.
And was some of the route familiar to your Vulcan planning?
Not really, because we were flying airways, and generally speaking, in the Vulcan, if we were doing high-level work, we were above the airway system anyway. Though, interesting enough, I do recall one incident back in the Vulcan days. We were flying from Singapore down to Darwin, and way above any airway system, and out of courtesy, we would speak to air traffic control, and they said, "Thank you very much. There is no conflicting traffic." And about 15 minutes later, we espied traffic on a track 90 degrees to ourselves at a very similar altitude, and wondered what on earth it was. And it turned out to be an American aircraft that was not speaking to anybody. Okay, we were fairly close to it, but obviously we were courteous enough to speak to air traffic control. Other establishments decided that...
was it a military?
It was military, yes.
Military, right, okay. What you've told us about your RAF career is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you've got some equally interesting anecdotes about your civil aircraft career as well.
I started off flying the Boeing 737, then I went on to the Airbus A300B4, which at that time was the world's largest twin-engined jet transport aircraft, passenger aircraft, anyway. And that was my first encounter with flying with a flight engineer, an interesting breed of people. I subsequently reacquainted myself with them when I flew the DC-10. To fly the A300, I went to Hapag-Lloyd in Germany, and that was a very fine little interlude, operating with the Germans based in Hamburg and Frankfurt. Orion became absorbed into Britannia Airways in about 1987, I think, and I had an opening with Monarch Airlines, which I took up. So I transferred across to Monarch, and I flew the Boeing 757 to start off with. And then when they acquired the DC-10, I transferred over to that. And that, for me, was a joy to fly. Nice big aeroplane, 3 flight deck crew, the flight engineer, and we went all over the place with that aircraft. And that was great fun. Stories to tell? I suppose the first time I went to Las Vegas, which of course is known as Mile High City, and the airfield has got a very long runway. It needs it. And we were taking off with a full load to come back to the UK, and I can remember us using up an awful lot of the 12,000 foot of runway, and I'm thinking, I hope we are going to get airborne here, and of course we did, but then we were into clear air turbulence for the next 3 hours, and it was the most uncomfortable flight until we got to the eastern seaboard. When the Twin Towers were taken out, we, with the DC-10, were doing a lot of rescue flights to Florida, and it was quite harrowing flying past the New York with this pall of smoke coming up, and the aircraft was subsequently taken out of service, I then, for my last year until I had to retire due to my age, went and flew the DC-10 with what was then known as Air Tours here at Manchester, and then I had to retire because of my age in 2002 after having flown for 37 years and some 16,500 hours of flying. So I look back and think I've done what I wanted to do from the age of 10 in my life, and it's been quite an enjoyable ride.
That's an incredible length of time to be flying, an incredible number of hours there. When you were flying into Manchester, did you see the white Vulcan at Woodford?
I did indeed, and I would look out and see it on the airfield here and think, oh, they've got an old B1 on the airfield there. How interesting. And I thought nothing of it. And of course, by a quirk of fate, many years later, I come onto the airfield here because we were looking for a new home, and the airfield was just being developed at that time. We went into the sales office, and there in the corner was a model of a white Vulcan, XM603. And I read the story on the wall, and it was fairly obvious that the aircraft that they had here was not a Mark 1, it was a Mark 2. Not only was it a Mark 2, it was actually a Mark 2 that I'd actually flown. And I dug out my logbook, and there it was, and it was the aircraft that I had actually taken out to Australia in 1968. We have another aircraft here at the museum, or the cockpit anyway, XM602, and I've actually flown that one as well. So not only do I live here on the airfield, but I've flown both the aircraft both the Vulcans that we have here. So I have quite a unique connection with the museum.
A very unique connection, I would say. Trevor, I really appreciate you sharing your story with us. I highly recommend the Avro Heritage Museum. They're the home of the only white Vulcan in the world, as well as many other historical aircraft and cockpits. Visit the website at avroheritagemuseum.co.uk. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.